Hi, everyone. So back in my organizer cap, I'll be chairing this last session. I'm happy to present the last speaker. Was supposed to be speakers, as mentioned by Boaz earlier. Anat will unfortunately not be with us today. This will, however, give us more time for discussion later. So we start with Karen Frost-Arnold, an associate professor of philosophy at the Hobart William Smith College. Karen is writing about ignorance, trust in the context of social media, feminist epistemology, prejudice, and will have us reflect today critically on the labor involved in screening toxic content and epistemic injustice. So just a reminder, for questions, please raise your hands using the reaction tab. And I think that's it. Karen, right over to you. I think you're muted. We can't hear you. Or is it?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. I just wanted to start by thanking the organizers so much for the wonderful workshop we've had over the past 2 days and everyone who's presented and asked questions. I've really learned a lot, and I think it's been some amazing conversations. So thank you all. I know it's a lot of work to organize these events. So thank you so much for bringing us all together virtually. So I'm really excited to finish up our workshop today by asking us to think about who does the labor of mitigating epistemically toxic content. There are so many problems with epistemically content, but my question is, who performs the labor of removing fake news, conspiracy theories, all kinds of toxic content online? And how are these workers treated? I'm going to argue that there's a particular form of epistemic injustice that these folks face that I think is going to teach us some broader lessons about toxic content and how we want to go about handling this in ways that are both just and epistemically fruitful. So I'm going to be talking about online content moderation. So I want to flag the work of Sarah Roberts. She is really the premier internet studies researcher on content moderation. So here's how she defines it. So it's the organized practice of screening user-generated content posted to internet sites, social media, and other online outlets in order to determine the appropriateness of the content for a given site, locality, or jurisdiction. So it's frequently performed now by contract labor in low-wage, low-status outsourced jobs, often in the global south. Social media platforms have gone to great lengths to hide the world of commercial content moderation from public view, cloaking the work of the laborers and the moderation policies in secrecy, for example, making moderators sign non-disclosure agreements, making sure that their social media platforms' moderation policies are kept secret from the public. So it's been really hard for scholars and journalists to get a picture of who's actually doing this labor and how it's actually working. But nonetheless, due to some brave whistleblowers and the work of scholars and journalists, we're starting to get a picture of it. So Sarah Roberts describes some of the ways in which this work is done as a kind of assembly line factory work. So you want to imagine there are tens of thousands of people around the world who do the work of sitting in front of computers, having fed to them a stream of content. You can imagine posts which contain fake news, conspiracy theories, hate speech, violent content. We're going to see some really disturbing content here. So they sit in front of a computer and they are fed this on a constant feed, and they are using some proprietary software that asks them to click delete for it to be removed from the site or allow for it to persist. So these workers are often subject to metrics that ask them to process each piece of questionable user-generated content within a matter of seconds, resulting in thousands of decisions per day and work that resembles a virtual assembly line of queued photos, videos, and posts constantly fed to a worker for decision-making. Now, some commercial content moderation workers labor at home using Amazon Mechanical Turk. These workers are incredibly poorly paid and also extremely vulnerable because they have very little support. While some people are doing it at home on their home computers, others are working in large office spaces. These folks often have extremely stringent expectations for the speed at which they work. So there's a documentary that I really recommend called The Cleaners. And in The Cleaners, one content moderator describes that his expectation is that he will view a target of 25,000 images per day. That's not nice images. This is the worst of the internet. And somebody is sitting in front of a computer for hours, being subjected to 25,000 images per day. But the scale of the work is not the only part that's difficult about this work. it's also the traumatizing nature of the content. So consider the effect that moderation work had on Henry Soto, who's one of the 2 Microsoft employees who sued the company after they developed PTSD doing moderation work. So each day, Soto looked at thousands of disturbing images and videos, which included depictions of killings and child abuse. Particularly traumatic was a video of a child being sexually abused and then murdered. The work took a heavy toll. He developed symptoms of PTSD, including insomnia, nightmares, anxiety, and auditory hallucinations. He began to have trouble spending time around his son because it triggered traumatic memories. In February 2015, he went on medical leave. Other workers also express the trauma that lasts for years after having done this work. So for example, I went to a conference with some moderators, and Rosalind Bowden, who was a moderator for years at MySpace, said, when I left MySpace, I didn't shake hands for like 3 years because I figured out that people were disgusting and I could just not touch people. I was disgusted by humanity when I left there. Another moderator says, there was literally nothing enjoyable about the job. You go to work at 9 a.m. every morning, turn on your computer and watch someone have their head cut off. Every day, every minute. That's what you see, heads being cut off. So given just this brief glimpse that I've been giving of the working lives of commercial content moderation workers, I think we can intuitively recognize this as a really unjust set of labor practices. These workers are toiling in the shadows. They often can't tell their family members about the kind of work that they're doing. They are paid poorly. They work for companies which resist transparency about the nature of the policies that they are implementing because they're not respected in the work that they do. Often they can't sort of complain or advocate for changes within the policies of the companies that they're working, which is troubling because these are often the folks who know the most about troubles with how the policies are being implemented. But often they don't have avenues to really express those concerns and have their concerns be given uptake. So I'm going to argue that reflecting on the particular type of exploitation found in commercial content moderation suggests that the following concept might be useful. So I'm going to briefly just like give you the concept, then I'm going to break it down and give some terminology and then apply it to some other cases later. So here's my first definition of the kind of epistemic injustice that I want to introduce that I think could be really useful here. So I'm introducing the concept of epistemic dumping, which I define as a form of epistemic injustice in which the labor of sorting, handling, and disposing of the toxic epistemic trash of epistemic communities is disproportionately performed by some, typically traditionally oppressed groups, while other, typically traditionally dominant groups, benefit from this labor, though usually being oblivious to its performance and dismissive of the epistemic labor involved in handling the trash. So I first want to explain a little bit how I came to use these metaphors of trash in thinking about epistemically content, toxic content online. So I'm really inspired by the use of trash metaphors by Sarah Roberts and Sarah Jung. In her really beautiful piece, Digital Refuse, Canadian Garbage, Commercial Content Moderation, and the Global Circulation of Social Media's Waste, Sarah Roberts draws the analogy between the illegal dumping of Canadian garbage, including dirty adult diapers in the Philippines, and the fact that much digital detritus is also transported to the Philippines, where it's handled by commercial content moderation workers. So Roberts really uses this language of digital detritus and digital refuse to draw our attention to neo-colonial practices of the dumping of trash. We see like the physical dumping of Canadian trash taken to the Philippines, dumped there through environmental pollution, right? But we also see neo-colonial practices of the dumping of epistemic trash from the global north onto the global south, right? Who's actually doing the labor of dealing with all of the hateful, false, disturbing content that appears on the internet from the global north? It's often people in the global south who are being paid pennies to do that labor. Sarah Jung also uses this metaphor of trash. So she uses the metaphor of garbage, referring to garbage as undesirable content ranging from spam to online harassment. And I think her work is really useful because she asks really interesting questions like, okay, there's lots of garbage on the internet, but why has some kinds of garbage been handled well? She talks about the early problems of spam and talks about how companies and engineers really developed tools for handling spam well. So we actually have quite sophisticated spam filters. But she asks questions about what other kinds of garbage, for example, online harassment. And she asks, why does it seem like the garbage disposal mechanism has broken down when it comes to online harassment? Why have we dealt significantly with the problem of spam, but not the problem of online harassment, or given the kinds of topics that we're talking about today, the problems of online fake news? So there, I think, are interesting questions for us to ask if we start thinking of this stuff as garbage. I also think that epistemic dumping might be a useful concept for epistemologists because online communities are not the only epistemic communities that produce trash. In fact, all epistemic communities produce discarded and unwanted byproducts related to knowledge, understanding, and communication. So for example, failed attempts at justification, false beliefs, misunderstandings, and miscommunications are all general types of what we might call epistemic trash. So consider just a completely neutral example that we've all probably dealt with as teachers, right? So you're trying to teach a text, you're trying to help your students understand what this particular philosopher or thinker is saying, and the students latch onto an example that they think illustrates the author's point, but it doesn't. This example keeps circulating in the discussion, leading them astray, leading them to misunderstand or misinterpret the particular text. And it seems that the job of the professor is to get them to throw out this trash, to recognize that this is not useful for their epistemic purposes, that it's leading them astray, and to get the epistemic community to throw it out. So that is a pretty benign example of what we might call epistemic trash. So given that example, I just want to give, for folks who like definitions, I'm going to give a definition of how I'm using the term epistemic trash. So X is epistemic trash for members M of an epistemic community C, if and only if X is an epistemic product of human epistemic activity. X is useless for or contrary to the member's epistemic interests and goals. And due to it being useless in this way, the members wish, or they ought to wish, to remove that content from circulation in the community. So this definition captures several features of epistemic trash that I want to highlight. So let's first start with the third criterion. With this condition, the definition emphasizes that trash is something to be discarded and removed from one's epistemic space. In this case, like one's epistemic community. Next, the first condition distinguishes epistemic trash from other types of trash that should be discarded. Epistemic trash is an epistemic product. The idea here is that many of our activities have epistemic consequences. They generate beliefs, understandings, etc. With the concept of epistemic trash, I want to capture the kinds of trash that are particularly interesting to epistemologists, and I want a concept that helps us focus on the epistemic features of unwanted items in circulation in a community. In contrast, one might argue that some online videos should be removed because they incite violence or violate the laws in other ways. So these videos might accurately be described as trash, but in emphasizing their incendiary or illegal nature, one wouldn't be describing them as epistemic trash, but rather moral or legal trash. A further point that I want to emphasize from this definition is that epistemic trash is interest relative. And I just want to highlight that I think this point nicely connects to Isaac and Boaz's earlier work on context collapse, right? So one person's trash is another person's treasure is, I think, a really useful slogan here. Whether or not something is deemed useless or unproductive may not be the same for everyone in the community, because the judgment is made relative to one's epistemic goals. So for example, consider what happens when the students are mistakenly latching onto this example that they think illustrates the author's argument. That's epistemic trash relative to the professor's goals of having the students understand the text that they're looking at. But it might be epistemic treasure relative to the epistemic goals of, say, someone from the Center for Teaching and Learning who's sitting in on that class, and their goal is to understand how do students go astray in trying to understand texts. That might be treasure for them, but trash relative to the professor's very different goals. So I think the interest relativity of epistemic trash is one of the many reasons why online content moderation decisions are so fraught. We have so many different communities clashing into each other, so many different contexts collapsing, that often what's deemed as valuable for one community will be viewed as trash for another community. That's going to be particularly important when we get to the concept of toxic epistemic trash. So importantly, some types of epistemic trash are more toxic than others. For example, the false beliefs of white ignorance, the misunderstandings of willful hermeneutical ignorance, and the damaging communications of hate speech are particularly toxic forms of epistemic trash. False beliefs, such as those embodying pernicious stereotypes, actively harm members of epistemic communities. They cause problems such as stereotype threat and internalized oppression. So these false beliefs are toxic epistemic trash. We could also see that many of the really harmful conspiracy theories and examples of fake news will be particularly toxic forms of epistemic trash. So here's how I'm defining toxic epistemic trash. So X is toxic epistemic trash for members M in an epistemic community C, if and only if it's epistemic trash for those members, and it tends to cause practical or moral harm to some members of the community. And obviously this is going to come in degrees, right? The more harm that it causes, the more toxic it is. So the idea here is that some epistemic trash is trivial or harmless, might be interest relative, while other epistemic trash does harm to members of the community. And so notice here, right, that the toxicity of epistemic trash, right, is going to inherit some of that interest relativity from it being epistemic trash. Okay, so I think these concepts of epistemic trash and toxic epistemic trash are really useful as we're thinking about toxic online content, especially in light of what I think we can go back to with my analysis of the labor of commercial content moderation. So I think there are many interesting questions that we can ask with these concepts in mind. So for example, who sorts and removes epistemic trash? What kinds of harms does one incur from handling toxic epistemic trash? Who's aware of the existence of epistemic trash? And who's willfully ignoring just epistemic trash piling up in their community around them? Another question we can ask now is, when is an epistemology of ignorance at play in hiding the fact of epistemic dumping and or the nature of the labor involved in handling toxic epistemic trash? So now, with those definitions in mind, I want to come back to this type of epistemic injustice. Right, so we have epistemic dumping, which is really a problem that happens when the toxic epistemic trash is disproportionately dumped on some members of a community, such that they have to handle it and they handle the consequences. So again, it's a form of epistemic injustice in which the labor of sorting, handling, and disposing of the toxic epistemic trash of epistemic communities is disproportionately performed by some, typically traditionally oppressed groups, while other, typically traditionally dominant groups benefit from this labor, though usually being oblivious to its performance and dismissive of the epistemic labor involved in handling the trash. And this last point will be important as I outline why I think this is a particularly epistemic form of injustice. So I'm not going to go into as much detail about this today, but I think that this concept illuminates a lot of different forms of epistemic injustice, right? So let's go back to commercial content moderation and think about the people who are doing the work of mitigating epistemically toxic content online. So the labor model of social media moderation is, I think, a clear example of epistemic dumping, in which the toxic epistemic trash of online communities is dumped on these commercial content moderation workers. The task of tidying up the hate speech of online platforms, the task of tidying up fake news, removing it, falls to low-paid, low-wage workers, often in the global South. And much of the public remains blissfully unaware of the many beheadings, child sexual exploitation, conspiracy theories, fake news, hate speech submitted to online platforms due to the work of these laborers. So, I mean, doing this work has dramatically sort of changed how I think about the internet. I get up, I get my cup of tea, I sit down, I get out my phone, I start browsing it. And now I'm aware of the fact that I am waking up to a somewhat sanitized form of the internet, even though it often doesn't seem very sanitized, it often seems horrific, right? It's already being pre-sanitized for me because somebody else had to confront a lot of the horrors of humanity and remove that so that I wouldn't see it, right? So the rest of us get to enjoy a somewhat sanitized internet because of the labor of removing toxic content is dumped on low-wage workers. Now, that doesn't have to be the case, right? You could imagine an alternative labor model in which this difficult work is distributed throughout the Silicon Valley workforce or other ways, right? What would it look like if Facebook changed its moderation model and Mark Zuckerberg had to spend a few hours a week doing content moderation work, right? Well, how would that change what he knows about what's going on in his platform? How would that also change the labor conditions under which that company exposes people who are doing this work? But that's not the world we live in. So there's some other examples that I think are really useful here, right? So we might consider the connections between the epistemic labor of commercial content moderation workers and the invisible labor of faculty from traditionally marginalized groups. So I think this concept of dumping also happens a lot in academia. Just as the task of tidying up the hate speech of online platforms falls to commercial content moderation workers, the task of handling the aftermath of an act of hate speech at an on-campus lecture often falls to marginalized faculty. So I don't know if this happens on your campuses, but on mine, it's often the case that if there's been an example of like racist hate speech, for example, faculty of color will have been dealing with this for weeks. They'll have been meeting with students, administrators, dealing with the aftermath of this, figuring out even maybe if the speaker who was going to come was potentially problematic, right? Dealing with that. And often white faculty members are completely oblivious to the fact that this labor is being done, right? And so that work is disproportionately dumped on marginalized faculty members. For another example, Kroll Kukla and Cassie Hobart have written a really interesting paper on how in the aftermath of sexual harassment in a workplace, particularly in an academic department, there's often a lot of epistemic labor that has to be done in tidying up things in the aftermath of that. As rumors are flying around, there's lots of false information about what happened. Here's how they describe some of the labor that's going on here. Knowing what work needs to be done involves deciphering who knows what about the instance of sexual violation in the workplace, and who needs to know what, and updating information about what sorts of harms are playing out and how information is spreading and circulating. This work is often stressful and emotionally draining and may require epistemic labor. Keeping the epistemic situation tidy and cleaning up debris is difficult and can be exhausting. And it can be made all the more so because it's work done to clean up somebody else's mess, right? So they talk about how disproportionately, say, women faculty members often have the labor of doing the epistemic hygiene work of tidying up in the aftermath of this, dumped on them disproportionately because they are viewed as safe. I want to talk about another example that I think relates to technology, which is thinking about racism within the field of ethical AI. So consider the treatment of incredible scholar researcher Tamika Brew, who was recently fired from Google. So she was the co-lead of their ethical AI team. She was the co-founder of the Black in AI group. Her work on bias in facial recognition systems and documenting and auditing artificial intelligence and other fields is groundbreaking. And so for 2 years, she was the co-leader of Google's ethical AI team. But she was doing some work on exposing racial biases within Google. She co-authored a paper which was critical of some of Google's work in natural language processing. And Google fired her, retaliated against her, and also engaged in really like a smear campaign of her reputation. So one of the things I think is really interesting in the aftermath of this controversy, Tamika Brew has talked openly about what it's like to be a woman of color working in artificial intelligence when so much of the issues of racism within this field are not being handled properly. So in an interview where she's asked to, given her experiences, talk to other women of color in this field and say, you know, what would she say to them? Here's one of the things I think is really interesting, she says. She says, so it's not only important for you to participate in this technological future, but think about an alternative future where your imagination gets to shape what kind of technology we're building. Because right now, your imagination is not shaping what kind of technology we're building. We're trying to do cleanup after all the white men who put us in this mess. We're not creating technology in our own imagination. They create technology in their imagination to serve their interest. It harms our communities, and then we have to perform cleanup. Then while we're performing cleanup, we get retaliated against, right? This, I think, is a really interesting line that I think follows not just in the artificial intelligence community, but also throughout Silicon Valley, right? Think of Facebook's original slogan that they liked, move fast and break things, right? So we have here, right, predominantly a really workforce of white men in Silicon Valley who have been creating technology that largely serves their interests. They've made tons of money out of it, but it has all of these incredibly difficult consequences for society, which are sort of dumped on the rest of the community, often because marginalized communities were not included in the design of many of these products. Then the consequences, for example, racist fake news, racist conspiracy theories, right, are disproportionately dumped on those communities, and they end up doing the labor of tidying it up. Okay, so that's my account of epistemic dumping. Philosophers might ask, okay, that sounds like a kind of, definitely a kind of injustice, but why is it a particularly epistemic form of injustice, right? So there's some disagreement among scholars in the field of epistemic injustice about how narrowly to draw the boundaries of that concept. I think it fits really nicely under a broad conception of what epistemic injustice is but I won't talk about that today. I'm just going to take the narrow conception that many people like, right? So this is Miranda Fricker's original conception of epistemic injustice as the harm of being disrespected in one's capacity as a knower. So I think that many, if not all, of the cases of epistemic injustice that I want to use the term epistemic dumping. So many of those cases of epistemic dumping do count as types of epistemic injustice in this sense. Because in many of those cases, right, the epistemic skills involved in dealing with toxic epistemic trash are not respected, valued, or compensated adequately, which is a sign of the lack of respect accorded to the work. So for example, commercial content moderation workers experience this disrespect as their epistemic skills are not valued. Social media companies have chosen to treat their labor as low-skill work that can be performed in an assembly line format, paid poorly, and hidden from sight. We can imagine another world in which the difficult work moderators performed was valued as skilled and nuanced, and the resilience many moderators develop was heralded as an important moral, epistemic, and emotional skill on which the social media companies and their users depend. So I think it's useful to think of moderators here as kinds of being treated as human computers rather than as epistemic agents. And this is a kind of epistemic objectification that disrespects them as knowers. So I'm going to wrap up with some questions that I think might be interesting for epistemologists to be thinking about with these concepts in mind, right? So there's been a lot of interest in recent years in the epistemologies of ignorance literature, right? So understanding that ignorance is not just something that's a passive absence of knowledge, but also something which is actively created, right? If we think about, for example, fake news is actively created by a whole set of actors, people with social, political, economic interests. The kind of ignorance that is produced by fake news is actively produced through many social institutions and actors. So that's, I think, the epistemologies of ignorance literature is well posed to study that. But I think it's been less well studied, and maybe some of my work here might be useful for thinking about the fact that ignorance also needs active removal, right? It takes labor to disabuse people of false beliefs. It takes labor to remove hate speech, problematic communication from our speech communities. And so I think it's interesting to ask what kind of epistemic norms, virtues, and structures are necessary for well-functioning epistemic trash removal systems. So in conclusion, I've argued that the labor model of commercial content moderation involves serious epistemic injustice. Reflecting on the utility of the metaphor of garbage disposal for this difficult and exploitative labor, I've suggested the utility of the term epistemic dumping to name a kind of epistemic injustice in which some groups are disproportionately charged with the handling of toxic trash of epistemic communities. So as we move forward from this workshop on epistemically toxic content, I hope that we'll pay attention to the profound injustices and traumas inflicted upon people around the world who toil in the shadows, making the internet safer for all of us. And thank you all so much for the chance to talk during this excellent workshop. Thanks.
Wow, thank you very much, Karen. And I think it was the perfect way to end this, reflecting from a different perspective. I'll open up for a short Q&A. Just a reminder, after the Q&A, we're going to have concluding remarks by Boaz and Arnon, and then we'll give the floor to all the presenters in the following 2 days if they have any comments on thoughts or remarks on the workshop that they want to share. And then general comments by everyone. Everyone will be able to share what they thought. So I see we have some questions. I'll start with Regina. Do you, oh, I can't see your video, but you unmuted yourself, right?
Can you now hear me? It was saying that
Yes.
I couldn't unmute myself. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Yeah, okay, thank you so much for the talk. And again, I'm sorry I don't have trying to juggle different computers today and there's no camera on this one. My question is about whether in the long term we should think about this in terms of exploitation, because it's very clear that the big social media companies are moving towards getting rid of human content moderators. Like Facebook's been transparent about this. They're using machine learning right now to learn from what the content moderators do. And they pretty clearly intend within 5 or 10 years to basically not pay anyone to do this anymore. So in a certain sense, the problem is going to disappear. But obviously that's not great for the people who've done this work meanwhile, and then are going to lose their jobs. So I'm just kind of curious if what you think about that part of the situation, that this is unlike traditional toxic dumping and unlike traditional waste management, this is a problem that is just going to disappear, and it's going to leave some of these issues we've traditionally had of exploitative labor when there's no better labor alternative. Anyway, sorry, that's a long ramble, but I'm really curious what you think about it.
Yeah, no, that's great. So let's see. So this is part of a longer chapter in the book I'm writing. So yeah, in the chapter I talk about this, actually this idea that algorithms are going to replace this is viewed by most people who work on this as like a smokescreen, that the social media companies. Most people think that there's no way that that's really going to work well, and that actually Sarah Roberts has this really compelling argument that we actually shouldn't want algorithms to take over all of this. So I'll just give that argument first, right? So an algorithm can't engage in disobedience. It can't push back. It can't refuse. It can't leak. So a lot of how we know about Facebook's moderation policies is that brave moderation workers actually leaked their training manuals to, for example, The Guardian. No algorithm is going to leak that, right? So part of the reason, morally speaking, we shouldn't want this just to become completely algorithmic is because we're going to lose some level of transparency. But also most of the people argue that that algorithms are just not going to be up to snuff in anywhere near that period of time to be able to do that work. They're nowhere near now. And there's evidence for this. For example, we saw that when COVID started, all the social media companies sent home a lot of their moderators, and there was a massive uptick, and they just had to rely on algorithms, just a massive uptick in just like misfiring of moderation moves. So most people think that given like the extreme context sensitivity of a lot of the images, the text that needs to be filtered and moderated, we're just not going to have algorithms probably ever, or maybe anytime soon, be able to do that. On top of the argument that morally speaking, we shouldn't want algorithms to do it. Also, it's also floated often as an argument that we could get rid of bias, right? Because human beings are going to be biased moderators, but algorithms aren't. But anybody who studies algorithms and know how they're also biased also thinks that that's kind of a problematic argument. So I think my sense is that most people who work on this in internet studies think that that's a bit of either a pie in the sky, these problems aren't going to go away, and also we're also always going to want humans in the loop, in which case we need to be thinking about how those humans in the loop are treated. So that's kind of a partial answer to your really good question. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. T, I will ask you to unmute.
Hi, Karen. Thanks for the amazing talk. I've got kind of a hazy question about the choice of metaphors. So the epistemic dumping and trash metaphor seems to me to fit incredibly well with the case, especially with that quote about Google making out like white men making algorithms. Like there's this stuff like people made, and it just like there's this byproduct that they didn't even think about, and it goes somewhere else. And that seems a perfect metaphor. For the original case, for the content filtering, sometimes that metaphor seems to me to slip for a little. Your definitions fit, but the metaphor slips. And the metaphor slips because I think, here's an alternate metaphor. Other hostile actors have laid down mines, and now we're using labor to go pick up those mines for us. So the difference is, I think a lot of the not all, but a lot of the content that's getting screened out is like actually being put there for aggressive intent to screw with people for the sake of harming them. And then the unfair labor involves putting people in front to soak up that harm. So I guess my thought is, I mean, we can use multiple metaphors, and each metaphor highlights certain things. So the trash metaphor seems to highlight exactly the salient stuff in the Google case, in the Google algorithmic case, but it seems to hide this like intentional harm, putting someone else to soak up that intentional harm part. So I guess one of my questions is, do you think there's something that the trash dumping metaphor reveals about those kinds of hostile cases that the kind of mine-filled war metaphor that's really natural to me hides?
I really like that alternate metaphor. I mean, it relates to a question I've been thinking over and over the past 2 days. So maybe if I can try and articulate kind of a worry I've been having. It seems like some of the issues we've been talking about with epistemically toxic content are smearing together both these hostile actors, but also everyday folks who are just confused, right? Or see something, misinterpret it, right? are ignorant and are spreading false news, or, so on the one hand, I think probably a lot of what we're concerned about is created by malicious actors. And it's probably an empirical question how much of epistemically toxic content is a result of that kind of work, in which case it seems like I really like your metaphor of the minefield, and we're sort of throwing people into that really difficult environment. But that doesn't capture also a lot of other stuff that I think is going on online, which is not necessarily like hostile, epistemically toxic content, but more captures this idea of like a byproduct. Like people just make mistakes, and people make mistakes often unintentionally. So maybe one example that I'm thinking about that might be helpful is a lot of stuff that Charles Mills talks about with white ignorance. I mean, obviously we're going to get into questions here about epistemic responsibility pretty quickly, right? But I don't know, like white people who are spreading racist conspiracy theories online, sometimes they're doing that intentionally, sometimes they're doing that as a result of hundreds of years of the erasure of collective social memory due to racism, right? And so some of that, I don't know if the minefield, the hostile thing works as well there. So maybe we need both metaphors, and we need to recognize it's just, this is part of why it's just a ginormous mess. But I like that idea.
Okay, so we'll have two final questions by Axel first, and then Isaac, and then we'll move on to the final part. So Axel, go ahead. Okay, I'll unmute you.
Great, thanks very much. A fascinating talk, and I really like the sort of, I'm totally with you on the sort of thrust to point out the hidden injustices underlying all this. It reminds me also of some of the work in science technology studies about cloud computing and the sort of the invisible labor that basically keeps up these infrastructures. And I just want to go back to the point about what makes that an epistemic injustice. I was glad you started addressing the problem. I was just thinking maybe I can push that even a little bit further. I mean, your suggestion seemed to be that here's real epistemic work. I mean, judgments, 20,000 per day being performed that doesn't get the respect it deserves. But I think even on a narrower or more traditional, you might say, conception of epistemic injustice, one can make that case. I mean, the person who can no longer interact with their child and sort of gain a kind of self-knowledge as a caring father or caring mother because of this work. I mean, they're being incapacitated in their capacity as a knower in a really sort of narrow sense. And that could add a little bit of a specific difference to why isn't this just sort of an injustice about people not getting the respect for the kind of dirty work they do, just like one could say for someone who maybe gets rid of garbage in the streets and stuff like that, also didn't get the same respect they deserve. But here I think there's really a sort of cognitive work, maybe to use a slightly more general term, a kind of cognitive injustice that's being done to these people. I mean, does that go in the same direction? Or
I think that's a lovely point. Yeah. I think somebody also pointed out to me that I haven't had a chance to look this up, but apparently there's some work showing that people who are exposed to more conspiracy theories tend to become more likely to believe them, right? So there's also a sense in which what happens when you're disproportionately exposing people to false claims, right? In what sense is that going to warp their epistemic capacities, right? I mean, just also think about Rosalind Bowden, right? Part of that is not just like the trauma of it, but she is being given, unfortunately, a like unrepresentative view of humanity, right? And so in some sense, that's also, I think, really corrupting her epistemic capacities by giving her extremely misleading evidence, right? So I think your question about like, what's it like to give people this kind of concentration and how does that affect their cognitive capacities would be another really nice way of putting it as an epistemic injustice. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. So Isaac, and then I might have a final question, but you go ahead.
Thanks. So I love a good metaphor, and so I'm trying to see all the directions that I can take the metaphor of trash. And so the first place I went was like, oh, so a good rule is pick up your own litter, right? Which would work maybe for people who are not, if we exclude the hostile intent part. But then I was starting to think about the different spaces where we encounter litter or trash, right? And how that metaphor might line up. So there's like these these places with paid moderators, which maybe are like garbage collectors or something. So there's a particular space where they encounter this kind of material. Then there are places we visit, right? Sort of public spaces on the internet, where comments or things like that might make it look a little trashy, and we don't really like to spend as much time there that way. And maybe we hire litter pickers, or maybe there's some sort of community effort to pick up or things like that. But then there's a third category, which are individual feeds, right? And this is where you get into the harassment side of things, right? Where everyone piles on to someone. And there aren't any mechanisms, as you pointed out, there aren't really any mechanisms that help people deal with this harassment. Anyway, my question is more like, can we actually identify these spaces by mapping them out, right? I mean, there are all these fun maps of the internet. Maybe they're not quite fine-grained enough for this kind of work. And then do we have to respond to these different kinds of litter or trash in different ways?
Yeah, I think that's lovely to think about that. So in the chapter, I talk a little bit about how I think, given the way social media spaces operate and actually how they offload a lot of the labor of sorting and identifying toxic trash onto users through the use of the flag, right? So like most stuff, the social media platform says, here's our policies, flag it for us if you think it's problematic. In some sense, that deputizes us as litter identifiers and sorters, right? So I argue that we need to start thinking about how do we want to cultivate the virtues of like virtuous trash collecting, right, and reporting, say on our social media sites. Like also, if somebody posts a racist comment on my Facebook post, I have to think about whether I'm going to delete it, right? And so I think your metaphor is really useful. We can think about, when am I going to tidy up my own epistemic space? What does it mean to be a community member? Sometimes I wish, like, say on like philosophy blogs, right? It would be nice if people tidied up some trash that they can see, rather than just like leaving it to marginalized people, right, to constantly put themselves on the line, right? So I think we could think of ourselves as developing different kinds of virtues and roles in different kinds of epistemic spaces by thinking about questions of, is this my trash? Can I be a good ally in picking up this trash, which is hurting other people? When am I well positioned to identify trash, right? So one of the problems we see a lot on social media is white people reporting people of color as violating norms. By when people of color point out racism, then a bunch of white people flag them as saying, "Oh, you're being racist against white people," right? So I mean, part of that also has to do with like how is actually it really problematic when in certain spaces people are deputized by social media companies to do this work, but they're not well epistemically prepared for it. So yeah, I mean, I think why this project excites me is it gets us to think about all these different spaces and norms, and how actually there's a lot of really difficult epistemic questions about when am I well positioned to do this work and how can I do it well? Yeah, so thanks, Isaac.
So I will take the opportunity to ask a question that will sound naive, very naive, or perhaps you can see it as a silver lining. But one of the things that I just thought about was we're actually putting a lot of power technically, because they're not fully agents, right? They have other people determining policy, but we're putting a lot of power into the hand of marginalized people. So this is like sort of a unique situation where we're giving like the opportunity to these marginalized people to sort of make the decisions, what is legitimate and what isn't to talk about, and to sort of have an effect on the public sphere. And I think I can't think of many other cases where we have this.
That's an interesting thing to think about. Let's see, some things that jump to mind is, right, so I'm a big standpoint epistemologist. As you said, I'm like, cool, that would be really great. If we really had like marginalized people who have epistemic advantages, who can really well identify whether something is epistemically problematic, doing the moderation work, that would be really great. Like that would be how I would design these kinds of systems. The problem is that the systems are not so well set up to have the people who are marginalized moderating content about their actual communities, right? So some of that epistemic advantage is lost, right? So we often have people moderating stuff about communities that are in completely different countries that they know nothing about. So as an epistemologist, I'm not feeling like that's much of a silver lining. And I'm also socially, I'm not thinking it's much of a silver lining in how traumatic it is and how poorly they're getting paid. So on the one hand, yes, like these decisions are incredibly consequential, right? So just to give one example, and I don't know exactly where the moderators were doing this work, right? The shooter in Kenosha, Wisconsin, who shot people had the Facebook group that he belonged to had been reported many, many times to Facebook in the lead up to the shooting, but the moderators had not identified it. And apparently, according to Facebook, they just didn't understand the language of white supremacists well enough to identify what exactly was going on here, right? So part of the problem here, it doesn't seem epistemically advantageous to have people who really don't know the communities moderating them, and also not much of a silver lining how traumatic it is, and that there's really bad consequences from the way that it's set up. But it doesn't mean that you couldn't reorganize it with some good feminist social epistemology, I would argue.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for the talk and the specific answer.